just your initial take, please, on the performance of the former president today. Did he do himself any favors with this testimony?
I don't think he did himself any favors in terms of how he fares in the outcome of this legal proceeding. Whether he did himself any favors in politics is a question that's not for me to opine on. But I was really struck by the amount of time that he spent really sort of taking on the case as a political matter, directly confronting the attorney general, even pointing to her apparently at times, taking on the judge and saying the judge was unfair, as opposed to engaging with the merits of the case. So that was very unusual, to say the least, and also very unwise tactically, because he was really antagonizing the judge, who alone is going to be making decisions in this case about what the proper remedy should be. The judge has already found in a partial summary judgment decision before the trial started that Trump and the other defendants are liable on the first cause of action of persistent fraud. And so really what remains to be decided is the amount of disgorgement of profits, and also what the remedy should be in terms of perhaps permanently enjoining Trump and his family members from doing business in the state of New York. And so if one person is in charge of making those decisions, it's really foolhardy to antagonize that person, the judge, by taking him on in such a repeatedly sort of personal attack. But again, I think that the former president probably had his eye on politics rather than the outcome first and foremost.
There really was, Professor, a very testy exchange. At one point, the judge said to the former president's attorney, please explain to him the rules. And the attorney shot back, quote, the former and soon-to-be chief executive of the United States understands the rules. And the judge said, but he doesn't abide by them. Do you think this acrimony can actually impact the case?
The only way in which it could potentially impact the case that Trump's lawyers may be thinking about strategically from their point of view is to try to create a record on appeal about the judge being biased against Trump. So to the extent that this acrimony was intentional and strategic, it would be to try to provoke the judge to act in a way that would be suggestive of bias toward Trump. And I think that this morning, we saw the judge at times cutting off Mr. Trump and even suggesting that he would limit his testimony and preclude him from testifying further and draw an adverse inference against Trump because of the way in which he was being so uncooperative answering the questions. There was a break at that point, and then going forward when they resumed, the judge permitted Mr. Trump to answer his questions in his sort of long-winded way and didn't interject nearly as much, following, I think, the lead of the state's attorney, assistant attorney general, who's conducting the questioning, who seemed perfectly happy to let Mr. Trump just go on at some length and not limit his answers to sort of yes and no. So I think that initially maybe the judge was perhaps going down the road of being provoked and then just sort of dialed it back. And so at this point, I really just don't see any basis for Trump to argue on appeal that the judge has been biased. But the antagonistic behavior may have been strategic to try to set up that issue on appeal.
Well, and of course, this isn't the only judge he is accused of being biased. I could say the same thing about Tanya Chutkan, who, of course, is overseeing the criminal case here in Washington in relation to efforts to overturn the results of the 2020 election, which, Jessica, just speaks to the point that while this is one civil case, he is facing a number of others, both civil and criminal. And I just wonder what we can expect, given what's happening in the courtroom in New York today and through the remainder of the week. Ivanka Trump also will be testifying on Wednesday. Is there any translation to those other cases? Should we expect him to be taking the stand in a similar way?
It will be very interesting to see how those other trials unfold if they take place. At this point, his lawyers are trying to delay them pretty much in every court until after the election. I don't think Trump is doing very well as a witness. In terms of the impact on the case. He's actually made some concessions that I think are damaging to him. He's essentially admitted to having played a role in altering the assessments, the valuations on the financial statements, which I think will ultimately come back to haunt him in terms of a finding about his involvement and level of intent. So I don't think he's a very good witness. He doesn't seem to be well prepared. He's not disciplined. And to the extent that anything he's now said under oath could be shown to have been false, he could be setting himself up for an additional possible penalty of perjury battery prosecution. So I think his lawyers and his criminal lawyers are in the courtroom watching, apparently. I think they're going to be taking note and most likely I would imagine, counseling him not to take the stand in a criminal case, where, of course, he has his liberty on the line, not just his finances, his money, and his ability to do business. But ultimately, it is a criminal defendant's right to testify in their own defense. So he would have to agree with their counsel, and it's going to be difficult to imagine what that conversation looks like.